What if I told you there was a design process that works for 99% of projects? And it consists of just 6 simple steps that, if done right, will help you sell your ideas and solve your clients' problems faster. Which, let's be honest, is why we got in this industry in the first place. I've battle tested this process over the last 15 years working in commercial graphic design, branding, and advertising. So I know it works. We call it the 6D process. You can call it whatever you like, but it's got me out of some pretty sticky situations over the years, and it can help you too. Sound good? Well, that's what this video will be about. Okay, so I promise this is actually quite a big unlock, so you will get a lot of value from this video. We're going to break it up for context into big projects and small projects, which are going to be big, we'll do 90 to 120 days, small will do 5 days. So just a quick sprint, depending on where you're at and what kind of projects you work on. The great thing about this, it does scale to the size of the problem, which is really handy. Okay, so the first D, if you haven't guessed it, is discover. Now, give me a chance. There's more Ds that you probably haven't heard of, but discovery. So when you're in a project, obviously, if you're starting anything, you need to kind of understand what you're doing. Now, if you're, let's do small, if you're doing a 5-day project, you're probably going to have a discovery call, which will be part of the maybe onboarding process. But actually on a project, you're going to have a bit of a discovery where you might call it a little bit of a brand immersion, or where you just kind of sort of understand the ecosystem that you're in. You're going to sort of download all the information, have a look at the sector. You might do a little quick audit. You might see where some opportunities to do some stuff are. You know, you're going to kind of understand the landscape a little bit better. And for that might be a day, but for if it was more of a larger project, let's say, you'd probably have a discovery phase, which would essentially be where maybe you do an audit, you do an immersion, you might do some questionnaires, you might talk to some people, you might do a bit of a data collection. A good way to kind of understand this is to do the 4 Ls, which I've harped on about, which is listen to the customer, look at the data, learn from the market, and live the experience. Those 4 Ls can help you get a ballpark of it. And that would be essentially what you do in the first phase, any kind of project. So big or small, you're going to want to discover, like, while you're in the room, what are we doing? Okay, cool. So next one, after discover, we're going to go, the second D is define. Now, obviously, once you've got all this like stuff, you'll have aggregated all this information, you need to process it somehow. You need to put it into, we call it a sprint department, we call them a sprint report. You would call them a speed report as well, if you're doing a really quick one, where basically you actually take all this stuff and you have to make some kind of assumptions. Maybe you get to look at some data and you actually have maybe ascertained what you're doing, what the problem is. That should culminate in some kind of report that is tangible, that you're going to send, or you're going to do an async loom over it, or you're going to have a meeting. It depends on the stakes of the job. But mostly you're going to bring everything that you found and provide a bit of an analysis and a sort of a roadmap to define, you know, what are the goalposts, what we're doing, where are we, where do we want to get to, what's in the way, what are the opportunities that we can do, what are the obstacles, where's the resistance, where's the bottlenecks, just kind of defining stuff, because we essentially need to aim at something. We need, you know, if we discovered a load of things, we need to define, let's say maybe there's loads of problems and we have to then come up with priorities. You know, what's priority number 1? What's the biggest fire that we have to put out? What things are we going to have to get comfortable living with? What is maybe a year 1, year 2 idea? What is just outside of scopes to avoid scope creep, that kind of stuff. This is great if you can do it before you start the project, but usually this happens in it. Okay, so after define, next D would be design. Now, I'm sure you're familiar with this. Now, how design can work classically, you can obviously, you might briefly go into like a stage 1, stage 2 creative kind of side. You might go initial ideas, you might have, you know, workshop initial ideas, stage 1, stage 2, that kind of thing, like the first stage of a design project. So obviously we're talking a lot more visual, verbal, graphic design stuff here, but like, let's say you have to design a solution essentially. So it's not just like, oh, I like this design on a singular level. It might actually be incorporate a lot of things, almost designing the initiative, designing the body of work, the package that we're doing, that kind of thing. So for a big context, if you're designing it, it might be maybe the legs of the project, the scope of the stuff, the infrastructure, the touch points, the activation points, like how do people move through stuff? How do people meet stuff? Where does it come on their radar? Blah, 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 blah. If it's more of a small project, it might very much be like, we've got a design and we're going to iterate on that and maybe choose the best one moving forward. This is where it gets a bit interesting because this 6D process can also apply to each one of the brackets. So I'll get to that in a bit once we've got through them all, but I'll show you at the end why you can actually use the 6D process within each D. But again, yeah, the main process of design is essentially general direction of a specific goal. You want to kind of aim at something. We've defined where we're going. Now we want to go towards it. And we're going to iterate in that direction. And typically, yeah, if you're speaking traditional language, it will get you to initial ideas, stage 1, stage 2, create. Okay, so now we've got 3 Ds under our belt. It's worth mentioning at this point that no matter what you are, big or small, there is a meeting required at this point. So that can be async if that's what you like. Depends on the stakes. Depends on the stakes. If the stakeholders and whether you can do that async, remote, all in the room, that kind of thing. That's up to you. So obviously we've got discover, define, design. Now that break is just to illustrate that you need to have a catch up, because the next side of things is a lot more of sign off, a lot more of kind of rollout, and a lot more of kind of getting it in the world. The first section is very much about input, very much about creative input. And the second is sort of gearing towards output and how that might look, or how that might, when it touches the market, when we press publish, what might happen in that department. Okay, so once we've had a meeting, basically what should happen in that meeting is that everyone should be on the same page. Everyone should be ready to move to the next steps. You might have to circle back. Sometimes there's a little bottleneck here, but ideally, if you've done your job right, or you've been in communication in the right way, we're ready to move to a lot more like less what about this, and more about output and application, and kind of starting to refine it down. So the next D, with that in mind, is develop. So you're now developing the solution. So it's no longer about kind of question marks. It's sort of like full stops and exclamation points. We're going to do this. Very much decision orientated. You're developing the solution in a specific way. You've now closed off a few doors. You've closed off a few avenues, and it's very much about developing that thing for sign off, essentially for delivery. And typically that would maybe be, if you're speaking kind of agency language, that would be like stage 3, where you'd usually get sign off and then move to sort of the guideline stage, move to the asset creation phase, move to like, actually, how do we execute the job? So the next D after that would be deliver. So delivery requires, if you're speaking old school language, you'd be talking about artworking. It'd be, getting stuff print ready. Obviously, we live in a lot more of a digital age now. So if all of that print language is probably a little bit out of date, but artworking is a good way to frame it. You're essentially, if you've come up with all these ideas and you've got them signed off, and now that has to be delivered in some way. There is a set of deliverables. We can, obviously you need to sell outcomes, and it is about outcomes, but at some point in this space, somewhere somebody is going to be using the stuff that helps solve the problem. And if they're creative assets, that probably looks like a toolkit, probably looks like a kit of parts, probably looks like a series of stuff. If it's just digital, it might look like content. It might look like, you might want to deliver a 1x1, you might want to deliver a 4x5, 16x9. You might want to see what that looks like. What's a scaling grid look like? What is, if you've got a brand property, what does it look like? How it shows up here, how it shows up there. If we're doing visual and verbal, what do we do? What's our headlines? We're doing ragged right, how are we doing it? Blah, 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 blah. Systemized it to a point. It might be best practices. For instance, at Sprint Department, we use an accelerator handbook. So it's not quite guidelines. It's a lot more focused about best practices. Obviously, you're getting your hex colors, you're getting your logos, your typefaces design. That's your fixed stuff. But your flexibility, maybe it's more of a sliding scale of, functional to expressive, because we want to iterate and we want to test. That's how we work. Your project might not be as free and iterating as that. We understand that obviously small projects, you're going to be, maybe it's one and done. So whatever you're delivering has to be kind of, it's now signed off and you're preparing it for delivery. That might include the presentation that you have to sell it in for final. That might include all the assets you've had to create. But it's about, output, getting it out the door, getting the stamp of approval, and you're off. So with the final one, the last D in the 6D process is deploy. Now, this is where a lot of designers kind of forget about this. They don't really think about this. And this is actually where I think it's the most important thing. Now, it's great to come up with an idea, send it off, sign it off, and then, give it away, take your money and disappear into the ether onto the next job. But actually, if you can be involved in the deployment, if it's bigger agency stuff, you usually will be. Sometimes it used to be the fact that you'd separate out. So maybe you'd have a design branding team, and you'd have a marketing team. That is starting to change a little bit. It depends, as branding agencies or design, the design industry maybe starts to be a bit more focused on data or on like success points. Because the reason why you need to deploy it is because you need to basically track, how are we winning? So I am in no way a data specialist or a data analyst, but if I was doing KPIs that were like, rather than vanity metrics like impressions and stuff that's very intangible and hard to measure, I would just do like base pirate metrics. It's called pirate metrics. I can't remember who coined the phrase, but essentially it's like 2 A's and 3 R's, which is like which is basically acquisition, activation, retention, revenue, and recommendations or referrals. Sorry. So being able to check that, if you have some kind of way, like what's the click-through rate? For instance, if you're on YouTube and you make a YouTube video, you're going to have CTR and AVD, that kind of stuff. All these usually annoying acronyms are some kind of data point that have or serve a purpose. Obviously, you don't want to track stuff that's pointless, but essentially, when you deploy something, you want to get a baseline of like what it was, and obviously the outcomes, so maybe where you want to hit. So what's that like top benchmark win that you can then maybe ask to get access or be a part of the access, because that then feeds into the case study. If you can say that something grew by 60% and then prove it, then you're starting to talk about outcomes a lot more. Rather, you can move away from talking about, okay, so we're going to give you 10 thingies, this, that, and the other, 1 by 1, 5 by 4, 60 by 9, blah, 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 blah. But at first, obviously that is a part of the conversation, but at first, you might have to do that. But if you can get access to that kind of data and talk about it, then it's in the deployment where the wins happen. So for instance, let's say it could be click-through or it could be downloads. That could be a really easy thing. And the way in which you've packaged that visual and verbal story has meant that deployment, we know what's working. The great thing, if you're involved in the deployment, or if you can be, then once you're in that, you're kind of speaking the language of the brand. So they're probably easily going to get you back to help that. So it's a good way of almost key man risking yourself into more work, because you also know what's going on. So moving on to recap, and then I'll talk about what I mentioned at the start. So discover, define, design, develop, deliver, deploy. Discover, define, design, develop, deliver, deploy. Try and memorize that. This little gap here is just to illustrate that you do need to have a meeting. I would love to have everything async. I've tried to do completely async stuff, but you just everyone needs to kind of just check that no one's getting fired, everything's happening. And it is quicker to do a little, maybe 60-minute, 90-minute catch up with a referral around about this point. Obviously, smaller stake stuff, done for you stuff, productized service stuff, maybe mid-low ticket stuff, you can probably get away with that. But if you're talking like 40, 50K, anything above 10 grand, I'd say someone's going to want to get on the phone with you and check in. It's in my experience. So yeah, make sure that if you think about this as well, discover, define, design is very about input, and then develop, deliver, deploy is very about preparation for output. So that's a good way to remember it. Now, what I mentioned earlier, have I got that on slide? Yes. Ooh, horrible slide this. So say you've got a big 60 process, which is 60 to 90 days, maybe 120 if it's a really big one, basically a quarter or a bit more. So say you're in discovery and you want to use the 60 process in discovery. So say you're in discovery and you want to define, so you're discovering, you're looking at stuff, you're reading loads of stuff. So you want to define where you're at, and then you want to, design which ones are the solution. How are you going to present that information? Is it going to be infographics? Is it going to be whatever? You're going to develop in that right scenario. And then obviously for discovery phase to be over, you're going to deliver that. And hopefully what's going to happen is they're going to deploy that finding somewhere in the business, and then you just zoom out. If you were doing a gigantic project, like a huge rebrand, you would want to, if you were doing discovery phase, and it would be more of a phase, you would have to define, your ICP, who are we talking to, who are we interviewing, who are we not, what are we not? We'd have to do some workshops. Out of that, you would have to then design some solutions from that. Maybe there'll be prototyping it. Maybe there'll be a development phase where you're not launching something, but you're kind of testing little features to iterate, or maybe do small sample stuff. In the discovery phase, maybe you have to do little things and then test it. And, maybe you're doing kind of like talking directly to your ICP and you want to do that stuff. And then you deploy a solution in more of a kind of like you're doing a little feature to a small selection of people still in the discovery phase that, allows you to then define, okay, we thought it was this, our assumptions have met feedback, and we've now been able to re-aim, pivot, and change. So you see, you can really kind of play with it. Hopefully that makes sense. So that is ultimately the 60 process. Use it, steal it, change the name if you can. And if you enjoyed that video, let me know. And if you're on YouTube, you'll enjoy the next video the algorithm is recommending. Cheers.